It's the evening of August 6, 1943. 4 Japanese destroyers are racing into the Vella Gulf in the Solomon Islands on a supply mission to an isolated island garrison. Suddenly, from the darkness ahead of them come the silhouettes of American destroyers and then the sightings of torpedoes surging towards them. A few minutes later, the Japanese ships would lie in ruins as a devastating ambush played out. This is how it happened. The story of the Battle of Vella Gulf began in the middle of 1943. After the Japanese withdrawal from Guadalcanal at the end of 1942, the battle between the United States and Japan in the southwestern Pacific moved northwards to the group of islands around New Georgia. At the end of June 1943, American troops landed on Vangunu, New Georgia itself, and Rendova. From this position, pressure was brought onto Japanese positions at Munda, with artillery set up and torpedo boats based there to harass Japanese supply lines. On July 2nd, US troops landed at Zanana and began a push westwards towards the airbase at Munda. Japan moved quickly to bring in reinforcements in response. Since it was now too dangerous to reinforce by sea directly, the Japanese planned to strengthen a base at Villa on the island of Kolombangara to act as a staging area for troops to be moved across to the northern side of New Georgia and then marched across land to Munda. It was also hoped that Villa could be a strong garrison in its own right, to act as the next obstacle to American progress. Trying to prevent this, the US landed troops at Rice Anchorage on the north side of New Georgia on July 4th, with a view to pushing south and cutting the route to Munda off entirely. They were supported by a naval task force under Rear Admiral Walden Ainsworth, which on July 5th conducted shore bombardment in the area on Japanese positions. Over the next week, the Japanese began running troops and supplies into Villa with destroyers, clashing twice with Ainsworth's ships in the process at the battles of Kula Gulf and Kolombangara. In chaotic night actions fought at close range, the Americans succeeded in sinking the light cruiser Jinsu and 2 destroyers, but lost the cruiser Helena sunk, had 3 other light cruisers damaged by torpedoes, and failed to prevent the Japanese from landing significant quantities of men and material at Villa. These battles exposed a long-standing weakness of American cruisers to Japanese destroyer attack, and prompted a shift in approach. After a change of leadership and the appointment of Rear Admiral Theodore Wilkinson, the light cruisers were withdrawn from operations in this area, freeing up the destroyers to be more aggressive instead of having to screen and support the larger ships. On the Japanese side, despite success in running supplies through to Villa, the mood was still relatively downcast at the main Japanese base of Rabaul, about 400 miles to the north. The losses sustained in the 2 battles of Kolombangara could ill be afforded, as a punishing rate of attrition on Japan's destroyer force continued. Up to the retreat from Guadalcanal, Japan had lost 11 destroyers to the United States' 15, but Japan's lower industrial base made this an unsustainable exchange. This had only gotten worse since, as months of fighting took its toll. Japanese naval forces in the Solomons were organised under the 8th Fleet, which in March 1943 possessed a single heavy cruiser as a flagship and destroyer squadron of 3, with the light cruiser Sendai and 3 destroyer divisions. In theory, each of these divisions contained 4 ships, but by mid-1943 this was basically never the case, as losses and the need for maintenance depleted the number of frontline ships available. In response, reinforcements were deployed, but even these struggled to raise force strength very much. In late July, Captain Tameichi Hara arrived at Rabaul to take command of his destroyer Division 27, only to find that 2 of his ships had already been sunk and another had been deployed elsewhere to cover a gap, leaving Hara only with Shigure available. With no time to waste, Shigure was attached to Destroyer Division 4, which was made up of 3 destroyers under Captain Kaiju Segura, who regular viewers of this channel might remember as the Rear Admiral who would command the cruiser Haguro on its last operation in May 1945. For now though, Segura's destroyers were tasked with continuing to bring supplies and troops to Kolombangara. On August 1st, Hara and Shigure joined another supply mission. Since the battles in the first half of July, the route through to Villa had changed. Rather than passing east of Kolombangara through the Kula Gulf, the Japanese ships were now travelling to the west of the island through the Vella Gulf. In so doing, they had eluded the patrolling Americans, and the August 1st journey, the second on this route, faced only a series of botched torpedo boat attacks as they headed south. The only damage sustained was on the way back north, when Amagiri rammed the torpedo boat with a mildly famous captain, prompting it to be replaced by Arashi for the next mission. Their return to Rabaul relatively unscathed was a relief, but it concerned Captain Hara when, on August 4th, Sugire informed him that they had been ordered to run exactly the same route again, with the same force strength and timings. To Hara, this seemed to risk disaster. It would surely be foolish to expect the Americans to fail to guard the Vella Gulf for a third time. He questioned the wisdom of the orders, but ultimately acceded to the more senior captain's instructions. The 4 destroyers left Rabaul at 3 AM on August 6th and started their journey to the southeast. Hara remained uneasy, telling the captain of Shigure, "This operation, at best, is unreasonable. Now I simply pray that luck will be with us." At 2 PM, they spotted a hostile plane circling them and intercepted a transmission sent from it that began with the word urgent. Clearly, they had been detected, but Sugire kept the same course for the next 5 hours regardless, before swinging around to the southeast at 7 PM for the run into the Gulf. The Japanese commander had ordered a speed of 30 knots for this approach, but Shigure, being an older destroyer, struggled to keep this speed, and began to slip back from the 3 in front of it. In response to the Japanese movements that day, 6 US destroyers were deployed into the Vella Gulf to intercept them. They were under the direction of Commander Frederick Moosbrugger, who led his own Destroyer Division 12 as well as Destroyer Division 15 under Commander Roger Simpson. Moosbrugger led his ships into the Gulf as night set in. At 9:33 PM, radar on the leading US destroyer picked up contacts ahead at a range of 19,000 yards. The American commander continued northwards, determined to press home a different sort of attack to previous engagements. Rather than opening up at longer range with radar-assisted gunnery as had been done before with the light cruisers, Moosbrugger planned to get much closer, into the effective range of his own ship's torpedoes, banking that the Japanese, lacking radar, would be unable to see his ships until it was too late. To the north, at 9:40, Captain Hara on board Shigure was lagging now about 1,500 meters behind the third ship in the Japanese line, Kawakaze. Arashi and Sugiura's flagship Hakakaze were further to the southeast. Hara ordered his ship's torpedo tubes and guns trained to the port side, fearful of US torpedo boats suddenly appearing from the open ocean. By this stage, though, the American destroyers were almost alongside the lead Japanese ship, and at 9:41, Commander Moosbrugger decided that they were close enough and gave the order for his division to make its attack. 22 torpedoes surged out of their tubes and streaked towards the Japanese line, which was still oblivious of the presence of their enemy. At the same time, Moosbrugger ordered Simpson to swing his division to the west, to cut across the front of the Japanese line and open fire with guns after the torpedoes had impacted. As the American ships manoeuvred, the seconds ticked down, until at 9:45, lookouts on the Japanese ships suddenly spotted torpedoes in the water, but far too late for their captains to do anything about it. The flagship Hakakaze was the first to be hit by 2 torpedoes, one of which disabled the ship's engine room. Behind her, Arashi was struck by 2 more, and Kawakaze by a single torpedo which went through the destroyer's magazine and caused a huge fire to break out on board. Shigure had more time to react because she had been trailing further behind, and Captain Hara quickly swung his destroyer into a hard starboard turn and ordered 8 torpedoes fired in the direction of the American destroyers, which could now be discerned as black shapes a few thousand yards away. But even with more warning, Shigure only very narrowly escaped the fate of its 3 companions. 3 torpedoes missed narrowly to the south of the ship, 4 to the north, and 1 actually passed straight through Shigure's rudder without exploding. Once the destroyer had settled onto a northerly course, Hara was able to assess the situation. To his south, the sea was lit by 2 Japanese destroyers ablaze, while a third was taking on water, and all of them were now under fire by US destroyers from both the east and south. At 10:10 PM, Arashi's magazine ignited, causing a huge explosion and the immediate loss of the ship. Soon afterwards, the gunfire ceased, and Shigure was unable to raise any of the other ships on the radio. Reluctantly, Hara decided to head back to Rabaul, mindful of his ship's damaged rudder and the 250 troops that were on board his ship as passengers. He signaled to announce his intentions and asked the Japanese base at Villa to attempt to rescue survivors from the other ships. It had been a costly defeat for the Japanese Navy. Of 700 crew and 820 troops on board these ships, only 310 survived. US casualties were nil. Captain Hara called it one of the most astounding torpedo successes in history. Vella Gulf was the first night battle between destroyers won decisively by the US of the entire Pacific War so far. Though Japan had begun with superior torpedoes, tactics, optics, and doctrine, these advantages have been steadily eroded away by the Americans fixing their defective torpedoes and expanding the use of radar on its ships much quicker than the Japanese. Now, Moosbrugger had shown how effective US destroyers could be when let loose against their Japanese counterparts, something that would prove very useful in future engagements. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hi everyone, I hope you enjoyed this video. Its creation was made possible by the generous support of the Historigraph patrons. It's been a tougher year this year in terms of sponsorships and ad revenue on YouTube, so the support that those guys have given us has really helped to continue making content for all of you on YouTube. If you want to get early access to every Historigraph video and get behind the scenes updates, please do consider helping to support the creation of this content on YouTube and let us know what you want us to make in the future.